Hey there folks, Mr. Finley here. This is the video for our unit on theater history, looking at theater in the Dark Ages, morality plays and commedia dell'arte, which are the primary forms of theater that show up in this period. Now, we've been looking at Greek theater, which goes back to hundreds of years, about 450 years BC, and wondering how we suddenly get to the Middle Ages. Well, Greece was taken over by the Romans. The Romans loved everything Greek except the Greeks. So they took their architecture, they took their gods and renamed them, they took their theater, and then they enslaved the Greeks themselves. But that meant that Greek theater went on to become Roman theater, which looked a lot like Greek theater. Big open amphitheaters, tragedies, some comedies, but Greek theater sort of transformed into Roman theater, and they were very similar. The problem is the Roman Empire grows and grows and grows over hundreds of years, and in growing becomes weaker, becomes too spread out. It splits in half, and therefore, because it has grown so large and fragmented, it becomes an easy target for various barbarians. And the Roman Empire, as an empire, falls in about the year 440 AD. So we've gone from about 450 BC to 440 AD. And theater is basically lost. Theater as practiced in the ancient world is lost as the theaters themselves are destroyed. Libraries are burned as the empire falls, so all those plays get lost. We talked about the fact that Sophocles wrote over 140 plays and we only have 7 left. Well, this is where that happens. And the other force that sort of gets in the way of theater is that the Catholic Church, which becomes very powerful in this period, as we'll talk about, they're not fond of these pagan Roman plays. And so for this next period, from 440 AD till about 1450 AD, a period of about 1,000 years, we don't have theater as we had recognized it in the Greek or the Roman civilizations. And we call this period the Middle Ages or the medieval period, or if you're particularly sort of cynical on this, we look at them as the Dark Ages, because we think of them as being dark, as without having the light of science and development from either the classical ancient period or from the Renaissance that comes after. It turns out, though, that there was a lot of really interesting stuff that happened in these 1,000 years. And so to call them the Dark Ages isn't quite correct, because some very interesting and unusual things happened once we had lost that Greek and Roman theater. So how do those things happen? Well, once the empire falls, we're left with, in Europe at least, lots of little countries relative to the empire, at least, and city-states and all that. And because of the division into these much smaller nations in the Middle Ages, there was less concentration of power and resources. And it takes resources to do theater. And so the Catholic Church, which was one of the few bodies that sort of crossed the lines of nations and city-states, becomes one of the few organizations large enough to stage large-scale plays. And the way they did this were in their cathedrals. Most major cities housed these huge cathedrals. You see one of the French cathedrals there. These were churches, yes, but more than that, they were religious sites that drew pilgrims from a very large area. Pilgrims would make pilgrimages, religious journeys to visit these cathedrals and see the relics of saints that were housed there. And for a lot of peasants living in the medieval period, this was the high point of their life, to make this journey and leave the land they were tied to as peasants or serfs. And it made them a perfect place to stage plays. You've got this built-in audience, you've got this big space. It would be a great place to stage theater, and that's exactly what the church did. After helping sort of to put down the Greek and Roman theater, the church itself began to stage plays in the cathedrals. Now, these plays look very different from what we would think of as drama today, just as the Greek and Roman plays did. And they also look very different from the Greek and the Roman plays. Remember, in the Greek and Roman plays, there were those unities of time, place, and action that Aristotle said, that they should take place, unity of place in one location. Church drama didn't do that. Church drama, instead of having one location like Greek plays, these medieval plays had many locations represented by many different sets. They called mansions, and they were built along the inside of the cathedral. So instead of there being one location, you would have a set for, say, the Garden of Eden, and then you might have another set for the Ark before the flood. So all these religious sets, and they would build different sets for each of them inside the cathedral. The word mansion, actually, if you go back to its roots in medieval France, a mansion meant a tiny house, and that's what these were. These were little houses built with sets inside the cathedral. You can see there on the right what the inside of a cathedral looks like, and you see in between each of those arches, on the left and the right of the central aisle, they would build one of these little houses, these little mansions with a set. Now we think of a mansion and we think of it as a big, gigantic house, but originally it meant a little house. And so you had these different sets or mansions, and the audience actually moved between them. The audience moved from set to set for different scenes. So first we'd see a scene, say, in the Garden of Eden, and then the whole audience would move down to the next arch, to the next mansion, and see a play, a little scene in another location. So suddenly here, instead of one location, we have multiple locations, like modern plays today, but instead of the sets changing, the audience literally moved from set to set. Now, eventually, as you see the note there, eventually these plays were performed outside because the cathedrals just weren't big enough to handle the audiences they would get. And these mansions, these sets, were put on carts called pageant wagons, and the audience would stay in one place, and the sets would drive by on these pageant wagons, and they would stop and they'd perform a scene, and then the pageant wagon would move down a couple streets and perform for the audience that was gathered there. If this sounds like a parade float in the modern day, well, that's exactly where parade floats come from. This idea of these big, elaborate, sort of moving images or moving sets that we have with parade floats, those start in the pageant wagons of medieval drama. Now, what were these plays like? Well, like the Greek plays, medieval drama was religious and ritual in nature, and it emphasized God's will. So that's very much like the medieval drama. These weren't about, the guy next door and his life and his troubles like modern plays like The Odd Couple or All My Sons. These were about the workings of God's will, in this case not the Roman gods, but the Christian God. But again, it wasn't realistic in nature. If you watch these plays, you wouldn't mistake them for real life. It wasn't realism at all. It was very much ritual, and the fact it was done inside a cathedral reminded you of that. There were two sorts of plays. There were plays called mystery plays, which were biblical stories, and there were plays called morality plays, which were about moral behavior, what was right and wrong, and what you should do or shouldn't do in life. Very strict, very religious, as you might imagine. And it was sort of made up for by the incredible spectacle of these very elaborate sets inside of the cathedral. Now, the thing is, wherever you've got a very serious culture, you always end up with a counterculture pushing against it. And that's where we get this thing called Commedia dell'arte, which was the other side of this. The serious church drama also gave rise to its opposite, which was this bawdy, lewd, earthy, improvisational comedy called Commedia dell'arte. It began in Italy, and Commedia involved actors who traveled from town to town, performing these lewd comedies involving standard situations and characters. So that's the other form of drama, where you had serious church drama, then you also had these comedies in the Commedia dell'arte, which was sort of the exact opposite from the church drama. So what did the Commedia look like? Well, first of all, it was performed in inn yards. In any given town, there would be an inn. It was usually built in a U shape, and there'd be a yard in the middle of it. And so these troops of actors would travel from town to town. They would set up their stage in the yard of an inn, and they'd perform for the people in that town. So it was the exact opposite of a church drama. For a church drama, pilgrims from the countryside would travel to the cathedral and see a play there. Commedia, the actors traveled through the countryside, through the villages, and performed wherever there were people. That setup, by the way, of A stage in the middle of a courtyard surrounded by buildings. If that sounds familiar, well, yeah, that's what Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, hundreds of years later, looked like. It borrowed that structure from these in-yard theaters of Commedia. The plays weren't written down. They were always improvised. The actors would show up, they wouldn't have a script, and they would get a situation, and they would improvise it. The situations they would improvise from were always standard situations, like, okay, we're going to do the play about the wedding tonight, or the play about this character cheating this other character. So you had standard situations, so we call them situation comedies. You can shorten that to sitcoms, and yes, that's the same word we use today, because most television comedies fall into this structure of a standard situation, and there's nothing very funny about the situation, but we put some funny characters into it, and suddenly becomes funny. If you watch a episode of The Office, for example, nothing that actually happens is funny. It's these bizarre, funny characters going about their boring life in an office that makes it funny. And that starts with these situation comedies of Commedia. And to make that work, you have to have recognizable characters. We call them stock characters. These are characters that have a sort of built-in humor to them. And the actors would spend a lifetime playing these characters. So if I played the stuck-up professor, I would always play the stuck-up professor. No matter what town we were in, that was my character. And I would play it so much, I would become perfect. Or if I played the really arrogant police chief, I would always play the arrogant police chief. And we would go from town to town, and you become really good at improvising those characters. What did these look like? Well, there's lots of physical comedy, so slapping and falling down stairs and all that sort of stuff. Not big intellectual comedy, but lots of physical stuff. Lots of earthy jokes, lots of sex jokes and poop jokes. Not intellectual stuff at all. Remember, this is the opposite of church drama. And also this stuff called lazzi. Those two Z's, it's like the word pizza. They sound like a T. So lazzi, which were little bits of silly stage business. You could think of them as, stupid human tricks for the medieval audience. And what was interesting is that these characters, these stock characters, these funny characters, would be the same no matter what troupe was performing. So there would always be, the stupid, mean, miserly rich guy. And there would always be the clever servant who tricks him. So no matter what company was performing, it would always be the same stock characters. And actors wore masks, and you can see them on the left there, to show what their character was. So if I'm seeing an actor from Rome perform, or if I'm seeing an actor from Venice perform, they could be very different actors, but they would be performing the same characters, and I would know who those characters were based on the shape of their masks. Arlecchino, the servant, always had that sort of big, full-cheeked mask. Capitano, who was the bragging soldier, always had the round mask with the long nose. So you'd always know, just by looking at them, who these characters were. And it turns out we still use stock characters today in sitcoms and such. We'll talk about that in class. But those are the two major forms of theater in the Middle Ages after Greek theater falls. You've got big, serious church drama going on inside the cathedrals, and you've got silly, earthy comedies that are improvised in the countryside by the artists of the Commedia dell'arte.